The moment 17-year-old Preston Ashford III uttered those 5 words to Officer Maria Santos, he sealed his fate in a courtroom that would remember his name for all the wrong reasons. If you believe in real accountability, hit that like button right now. The air inside Courtroom 7B hung thick and heavy on that Tuesday morning, the kind of atmosphere that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel deliberate. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long geometric shadows across the polished oak floors, illuminating specks of dust that drifted lazily through beams of light, like tiny witnesses to the drama about to unfold. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the back wall, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their collective presence creating a wall of anticipation that seemed to pulse with its own energy. The wooden benches creaked under shifting weight. Someone coughed nervously. A briefcase clicked shut. The sound of a pen tapping against a legal pad echoed like a metronome counting down to an explosion. Judge Elias Monroe sat elevated behind the bench, his silver hair catching the light, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his weathered nose as he reviewed documents with methodical precision. At 63 years old, Monroe carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. His face was a landscape of experience, lined with decades of witnessing humanity at its best and worst, yet his dark eyes remained sharp, penetrating, capable of reading the truth beneath carefully constructed lies. He wore his black robe like armor, a symbol of the law he had devoted his life to upholding with unwavering integrity. When Judge Monroe entered a courtroom, conversations died. Phones were silenced without being asked. Even attorneys who had appeared before him hundreds of times felt their spines straighten involuntarily. Today's case had drawn unprecedented attention. Preston Ashford III, the only son of real estate mogul Preston Ashford Jr., sat at the defense table with the kind of posture that suggested he was enduring an inconvenience rather than facing serious criminal charges. At 17, Preston had the lean build of someone who spent more time at country clubs than in actual physical labor. His blonde hair styled with the casual perfection that required more effort than it appeared, his designer suit tailored to his frame with precision that cost more than most people earned in a month. His blue eyes scanned the courtroom with barely concealed contempt, as if cataloging everyone present and finding them all beneath his notice. Preston's attorney, Richard Claiborne, was a shark in a $1,000 suit, representing the firm that had kept the Ashford family out of legal trouble for 3 generations. Claiborne had the smooth confidence of a man who believed every problem could be solved with the right combination of money, connections, and legal maneuvering. His silver cufflinks caught the light as he arranged his notes, occasionally leaning toward his client to whisper instructions that Preston half listened to while scrolling through his phone under the table. Across the aisle sat Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park, a woman in her early 40s whose reputation for preparation and prosecutorial precision had earned her the respect of even her opponents. Her dark suit was professional and understated, her expression focused and determined. Park had built her career on cases others deemed unwinnable, and she had a particular distaste for entitled defendants who believed their family names granted them immunity from consequences. Behind Park sat Officer Maria Santos, the 34-year-old police officer whose testimony would prove central to the case. Santos wore her dress uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her hands folded in her lap with military precision. But those who looked closely could see the subtle tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her fingers, the shadow behind her eyes of someone who had been through something that left marks deeper than any physical injury. Judge Monroe set down the documents he had been reviewing and removed his reading glasses with deliberate slowness. The simple gesture commanded instant attention. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the bench. The ambient noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations evaporated into absolute silence. Case number 2024 CR 8847, Monroe's voice filled the space with quiet authority, each word measured and clear. The people versus Preston James Ashford III. The defendant is charged with assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, reckless driving, and destruction of public property. He paused, allowing the weight of the charges to settle over the room. How does the defendant plead? Richard Claiborne rose smoothly, his practiced courtroom smile already in place. Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. Furthermore, we will be demonstrating that this entire prosecution is based on a gross mischaracterization of events and represents a fundamental misunderstanding of... We'll get to your arguments during the appropriate portion of these proceedings, Mr. Claiborne. Monroe interrupted without raising his voice. Sit down. Claiborne's smile flickered but held. He sat. Miss Park, Monroe continued, call your first witness. Jennifer Park rose, her movements economical and purposeful. The people call Officer Maria Santos to the stand. Officer Santos walked to the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who had been through this process before, but never under circumstances quite like these. After being sworn in, she took her seat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes forward. Park approached the witness stand, her expression professional but kind. Officer Santos, can you please tell the court about your background in law enforcement? Santos's voice was steady, professional. I've been with the Metropolitan Police Department for 12 years. I spent 8 years on patrol before joining the Traffic Enforcement Division 4 years ago. I hold commendations for community service and have completed advanced training in de-escalation tactics and crisis intervention. Thank you, officer. Now, can you describe the events of April 14th of this year? Santos took a measured breath, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her features. I was conducting routine traffic enforcement on Highway 7 near the intersection with Oakmont Boulevard. At approximately 9:47 p.m., I clocked a vehicle traveling at 93 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone. And what did you do? I activated my lights and siren and initiated a traffic stop. The vehicle, a black Porsche 911 Turbo S, initially appeared to be slowing down, but then suddenly accelerated, reaching speeds in excess of 110 miles per hour. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Monroe's eyes shifted toward the crowd, and the sound died instantly. Continue, officer, Park prompted. The pursuit lasted approximately 4 minutes. The vehicle ran 2 red lights, forced 3 other cars off the road, and eventually lost control, attempting to take a turn at excessive speed. The Porsche struck a public utility box, causing approximately $60,000 in damage and knocking out power to over 300 homes. Park nodded slowly, allowing the testimony to resonate. What happened after the vehicle crashed? Santos's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I approached the vehicle with my weapon drawn, following standard protocol for a high-risk traffic stop involving felony evasion. The driver's side door opened, and the defendant exited the vehicle. Describe the defendant's demeanor. He was laughing. Santos's voice remained level, but something cold had entered her tone. He was literally laughing as he got out of the car. I ordered him to put his hands on the vehicle and submit to arrest. Instead, he turned to face me and said, "Do you have any idea who my father is?" Preston shifted in his seat at the defense table, his expression flickering between irritation and amusement. What did you respond? I informed him that I didn't care who his father was, that he was under arrest for felony evasion, reckless endangerment, and multiple traffic violations. I ordered him again to place his hands on the vehicle. Did he comply? No, ma'am. He took several steps toward me, despite my commands to stop. He pulled out his phone and began recording me, saying he was going to have my badge by morning. I warned him that approaching an officer during an arrest was illegal and potentially dangerous. He continued approaching. I holstered my weapon and prepared to place him under arrest using hands-on control techniques. Park moved closer to the witness stand, her voice dropping slightly. And what happened when you attempted to arrest him? The courtroom seemed to lean forward as one. Even the air felt charged with anticipation. Santos's eyes found Preston across the room, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of something raw and honest. He said, "You can't touch me." Then he shoved me backward with both hands, causing me to fall onto the pavement. While I was down, he kicked my radio approximately 15 feet away and smashed my body camera under his foot. Then he stood over me and said, "My father owns people like you. You're finished." The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Several people shook their heads in disbelief. Judge Monroe raised one hand, and silence descended like a curtain dropping. Park let the testimony hang in the air for a long moment before continuing. "What injuries did you sustain?" "Severe bruising to my back and ribs, a sprained wrist, contusions on both arms, and a concussion from striking my head on the pavement." "How long were you off duty?" 3 weeks. Park walked back to a table and retrieved a tablet, then approached the witness stand. "Officer Santos, I'm showing you People's Exhibit 7, which is footage from your dash camera. Can you confirm this is accurate footage from the incident?" Santos watched the screen, her expression hardening. "Yes, that's accurate. Your Honor, the people request permission to play this footage for the court." Monroe nodded once. "Proceed." The large screen mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. The footage was crystal clear, shot in high-definition night vision. It showed exactly what Officer Santos had described. The high-speed chase through residential streets, the Porsche weaving recklessly through traffic, the violent crash, and then the confrontation. But what the dash camera captured in audio made it even more damning. Preston's voice, arrogant and mocking. "Do you have any idea who my father is? He practically owns this city. You're making the biggest mistake of your pathetic little career." Officer Santos, professional and firm. "Sir, you need to place your hands on the vehicle now. This is your last warning." Preston, laughing. "Or what? You'll shoot me? That would be fun to explain. Go ahead, Officer Nobody. Try to arrest me. See what happens." The sound of the confrontation was clear. The scuffle, the thud of Santos hitting the pavement, the crunch of the body camera being destroyed, and then Preston's voice, cold and cruel. "My father owns people like you. You're finished. You'll be directing traffic in some nowhere town by next week if you're lucky enough to keep your badge at all." The footage ended. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Judge Monroe's expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had hardened into cold steel. Preston, incredibly, was smirking at the defense table, as if the footage had just shown him winning a debate rather than committing multiple felonies on camera. Park turned back to Officer Santos. "One final question, officer. In your 12 years of law enforcement, have you ever encountered a situation quite like this?" Santos shook her head slowly. "Never. I've dealt with people who were scared, people who were angry, people who were intoxicated or mentally disturbed. But I've never encountered someone who genuinely believed that they were entitled to assault a police officer and face no consequences because of their family name. Thank you, Officer Santos. No further questions." Judge Monroe looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Claiborne, your witness." Richard Claiborne rose, and his strategy became immediately apparent. He was going to try to make Officer Santos the problem. "Officer Santos, you mentioned you've been in law enforcement for 12 years. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And in those 12 years, have you ever been the subject of an internal affairs investigation?" Park shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor." "Relevance?" "I'm establishing the witness's credibility, Your Honor," Claiborne replied smoothly. Monroe's gaze could have frozen water. "The witness's credibility is not at issue here, Mr. Claiborne. We have video evidence of the entire incident, but I'll allow the question. Answer, Officer Santos." Santos's voice remained level. "Yes, I was investigated once, 7 years ago." Claiborne pounced. "Can you describe that investigation?" "A motorist claimed I used excessive force during an arrest. The investigation found the complaint was without merit and I was fully exonerated. But there was a complaint which was investigated and dismissed," Park interjected sharply. Claiborne switched tactics. "Officer Santos, on the night in question, when my client exited his vehicle, did you have your firearm drawn?" "Yes, per standard protocol for a felony traffic stop." So you were pointing a gun at a 17-year-old boy? Park stood again. Objection. Mischaracterizes the testimony and ignores the defendant's actions, leading to the stop. Sustained, Monroe said flatly. Rephrase, Mr. Claiborne. Claiborne shifted smoothly. Officer Santos, might my client have felt threatened by having a firearm pointed at him? If he felt threatened, the appropriate response would have been to comply with my lawful orders, not to assault me. But you were pointing a gun at a teenager. I was attempting to arrest a fleeing felon who had just led police on a high-speed chase that endangered multiple lives, Santos interrupted, her voice still professional but carrying an edge of steel. A fleeing felon who then assaulted me and destroyed evidence. His age does not grant him immunity from consequences. Claiborne's expression tightened. He was losing ground, and he knew it. No further questions. Judge Monroe studied Claiborne for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Redirect, Ms. Park? Briefly, Your Honor. Park approached the witness stand again. Officer Santos, in your training and experience, when someone flees from police at high speed and then assaults an officer, what does that indicate about their mindset? It indicates a complete disregard for public safety, for the law, and for the potential consequences of their actions. Thank you. Nothing further. Monroe nodded. Officer Santos, you may step down. Ms. Park, call your next witness. The people call Dr. Raymond Foster. A distinguished man in his 50s took the stand, identified himself as the emergency room physician who had treated Officer Santos that night. Dr. Foster, can you describe Officer Santos's injuries? She had significant trauma consistent with a fall onto pavement. Severe contusions across her back and ribs, a grade 2 wrist sprain, multiple abrasions, and a mild concussion. She was in considerable pain. In your medical opinion, could these injuries have been more severe? Absolutely. If she had struck her head at a slightly different angle, we could have been looking at a skull fracture, brain hemorrhage, or worse. She was fortunate. Thank you, Doctor. The testimony continued through the afternoon. The prosecution called the responding backup officers, who testified to Preston's continued belligerence even after being restrained. They called the witnesses whose cars had been forced off the road during the chase, including a young mother with 2 children in car seats, who testified about the terror of seeing a Porsche bearing down on her at over 100 miles per hour. They called the utility company representative, who detailed the extensive damage and costs. Through it all, Preston sat at the defense table with an expression that cycled between boredom and irritation, occasionally whispering to his attorney, checking his watch, and once actually yawning visibly. In the gallery, Preston Ashford Jr. sat with his second wife, a woman 30 years his junior. The elder Ashford was a man who had built a real estate empire through aggressive tactics and political connections, and he watched the proceedings with the cold calculation of someone used to buying his way out of problems. His presence in the courtroom was meant to intimidate, to remind everyone of the family's power and influence. It was late afternoon when the prosecution rested. The western sun streamed through the tall windows, painting everything in amber light that should have been beautiful, but instead felt oppressive, heavy, marking the passage of time toward an inevitable reckoning. Judge Monroe called a brief recess, then returned to hear the defense's case. Richard Claiborne stood, his confidence apparently unshaken despite the damning testimony. Your Honor, the defense calls Preston Ashford III to the stand. Preston stood, with the casual grace of someone walking onto a stage rather than a witness stand. He was sworn in with a hand that didn't tremble, took his seat with a posture that suggested he was doing everyone a favor by being there. Claiborne approached with the air of a director, prompting a rehearsed actor. Preston, can you tell the court about your background? Preston's voice carried the cultivated accent of expensive private schools and exclusive social circles. I'm 17 years old. I'm a senior at Westmont Academy. I have a 3.8 GPA. I'm captain of the lacrosse team, and I've been accepted to Yale for next fall. And can you describe your relationship with your family? My father is Preston Ashford Jr., who runs Ashford Development Corporation. My mother passed away when I was 12. My father has worked very hard to provide opportunities for me, and I've tried to make the most of them." Claiborne nodded sympathetically. "Now, Preston, let's talk about the night of April 14th. Can you tell us in your own words what happened?" Preston shifted in his seat, adopting an expression of wounded innocence that he had clearly practiced. "I had been at a friend's house, studying for finals. I was driving home when I saw police lights behind me. I honestly didn't think I was speeding that much, but I pulled over immediately. The footage shows your vehicle accelerating after the initial lights were activated. I was looking for a safe place to pull over. The shoulder there is really narrow, and I didn't want to cause a hazard. I was going to pull off at the next exit. It was a lie, and everyone in the courtroom knew it was a lie, but Claiborne continued as if Preston had just offered irrefutable truth. "What happened when you stopped?" "Officer Santos approached my vehicle with her gun drawn, screaming at me. I was terrified. I've never had any interaction with police before, and suddenly there's someone pointing a gun at me, yelling. I got out of the car because I thought that's what she wanted me to do. And then, she was aggressive from the beginning. I tried to explain that there must be some misunderstanding, that I hadn't done anything wrong. I may have mentioned my father's name, not as a threat, but because I was scared, and I guess I thought maybe she would realize this was all a mistake." Officer Santos in the gallery closed her eyes briefly as if praying for patience. "Did you assault Officer Santos?" "Absolutely not. She came at me aggressively, and I raised my hands defensively. We made contact, but it was entirely accidental. She lost her balance and fell. I immediately tried to help her up, but she started screaming at me again, so I backed away." The lie was so brazen, so completely contradicted by the video evidence, that several people in the gallery made sounds of disbelief. Preston continued, warming to his narrative. "I think Officer Santos had already decided to make an example of me because of who my family is. I think she saw an opportunity to create a situation that would get her recognition, or maybe even a promotion. The whole thing was a setup from the beginning." Judge Monroe's expression hadn't changed, but his pen, which had been taking notes, had stopped moving. He was staring at Preston with the focus of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen of toxic fungus. Claiborne pressed on. "Preston, I need to ask you this directly. Do you think you're above the law?" Preston actually laughed, a sound of practiced charm. "Of course not. I respect law enforcement. I respect the legal system. I'm here today because I believe in the justice system, because I know that once the truth comes out, everyone will see this for what it really is, a tragic misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion." No further questions. As Claiborne returned to his seat, he looked pleased with himself, as if his client had just delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. Judge Monroe looked toward the prosecution table. "Ms. Park, your witness." Jennifer Park stood slowly, and there was something predatory in her movement, a sense of a trap about to snap shut. She approached the witness stand and simply stood there for a long moment, studying Preston the way one might study an insect under glass. "Mr. Ashford, you testified that you have a 3.8 GPA at Westmont Academy. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Westmont Academy costs approximately $75,000 per year in tuition. Is that correct?" Claiborne started to object, but seemed to think better of it. Preston shrugged. "I don't know the exact amount. My father handles that." "You also mentioned you're captain of the lacrosse team. Does your family make donations to Westmont's athletic program?" "I believe my father supports the school, yes. To the tune of $500,000 per year." Preston's expression flickered. "I don't know the exact details of my father's charitable giving." Park smiled thinly. "Of course not. Now, you testified that you thought you were being pulled over for speeding not that much. How fast do you think you were going? Maybe 60, 65? Officer Santos clocked you at 93 miles per hour in a 55 zone. Does that sound like not that much to you?" "I wasn't looking at my speedometer constantly. I was focused on the road. Evidently not focused enough to avoid going 93 in a 55. Park's voice remained level, almost conversational. You also testified that you accelerated because you were looking for a safe place to pull over. Is that correct? Yes. Mr. Ashford, you led Officer Santos on a 4-minute pursuit, reached speeds exceeding 110 miles per hour, ran 2 red lights, and forced 3 cars off the road. Does that sound like someone looking for a safe place to pull over? I was scared. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were scared, but you were going faster. That doesn't make sense, does it? I just wanted to get to a more public area. Park walked to the prosecution table and retrieved a document. Your Honor, I'd like to present People's Exhibit 14, which is a traffic analysis of Highway 7. It shows that between the initial attempted stop and the point where the defendant crashed, he passed 7 locations that would have been perfectly safe to pull over, including 2 well-lit parking lots and a gas station. She turned back to Preston. So you passed 7 safe locations because you were looking for a safe location. Preston's jaw tightened. I didn't see those. You didn't see the gas station with lights visible from a quarter mile away? I was focused on driving. Focused on fleeing, you mean? Claiborne stood. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. Sustained, Monroe said, but his tone suggested he found the argument perfectly valid. Park shifted gears. Mr. Ashford, you testified that when Officer Santos approached you, she was screaming at you with her gun drawn. Is that correct? Yes. Let's watch the footage again, shall we? Park nodded to her assistant, who replayed the dash camera footage. Officer Santos's voice came through clearly, firm, professional, following exact protocol. There was no screaming. Her commands were calm and clear. The footage ended. Park turned back to Preston. Does that sound like screaming to you? Preston shifted uncomfortably. She was very aggressive in her tone. Or was she simply being a police officer attempting to arrest someone who had just led her on a dangerous, high-speed chase? She had a gun pointed at me, as is standard protocol for a felony traffic stop, which your actions had created. Now, you testified that when Officer Santos fell, it was because of accidental contact. Is that your testimony? Yes. Park had the footage queued up again. This time, she played it frame by frame, showing Preston's hands making clear, deliberate contact with Officer Santos's shoulders, showing the force of the push, showing Santos falling backward, her arms pinwheeling as she tried to catch her balance. The moment her head struck the pavement, does that look accidental to you, Mr. Ashford? Preston's face had flushed red. It happened very fast. Then let's slow it down even more. Park played the footage again, this time at quarter speed. The push was undeniable, deliberate, violent. Still accidental? Preston said nothing. You also testified that you tried to help Officer Santos up. Is that correct? Yes, I tried to help her. Really? Let's watch what you actually did. Park played the next segment of footage, showing Preston kicking Officer Santos's radio away, then deliberately stomping on her body camera. Does that look like helping to you? Preston's attorney was making notes furiously, probably already composing his appeal brief. Park moved closer to the witness stand, her voice dropping lower. Mr. Ashford, do you remember what you said to Officer Santos while she was on the ground? I don't remember exactly. Let me refresh your memory. You said, my father owns people like you. You're finished. Do you recall that? Preston's eyes darted to his father in the gallery. I might have said something like that. Something like that, Park repeated. Mr. Ashford, do you believe your father owns people? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I just meant that my father has connections, that he would help me clear this up. Clear this up? You mean make your crimes disappear? Objection. Claiborne was on his feet. Withdrawn, Park said smoothly. Mr. Ashford, you mentioned you've been accepted to Yale. Have you told Yale about this incident? Preston's face went pale. The charges haven't been resolved yet. So that's a no. Yale's code of conduct requires disclosure of all pending criminal charges. You are aware of that, aren't you? Preston said nothing. Let me ask you something else, Mr. Ashford. You mentioned you respect law enforcement. If you respect law enforcement, why did you assault a police officer? I didn't assault her. It was an accident. An accident that resulted in a concussion, sprained wrist, severe bruising, and 3 weeks of lost work. I didn't mean for her to get hurt. But you did mean to push her. No, You did mean to kick her radio away. That was just... You did mean to destroy her body camera. I wasn't thinking... Exactly. Park's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. You weren't thinking about anyone but yourself. You weren't thinking about Officer Santos, who has dedicated 12 years to serving this community. You weren't thinking about the families whose cars you forced off the road. You weren't thinking about the 300 households that lost power. You were only thinking about yourself, about how your family name should protect you, about how the rules that apply to everyone else shouldn't apply to you. Preston's composure had completely shattered. His face was flushed, his hands were shaking, and his eyes darted around the courtroom like a cornered animal looking for escape. Park turned to Judge Monroe. No further questions, Your Honor. Preston practically fled the witness stand, returning to the defense table where Claiborne tried to offer whispered reassurances that fell on deaf ears. The defense rested shortly after, calling only a character witness, Preston's headmaster from Westmont Academy, who testified that Preston was a generally good student who had never shown this kind of behavior at school. Park's cross-examination established that the headmaster's school received $500,000 annually from the Ashford family and that Preston had never faced any disciplinary action at Westmont, despite several complaints from other students and faculty that had mysteriously disappeared from his record. As the afternoon wore into evening, closing arguments began. Claiborne made an impassioned plea about youthful mistakes, fear, and misunderstanding. He painted Preston as a scared teenager who had made poor decisions in a moment of panic. Jennifer Park's closing was surgical. She walked the jury through every piece of evidence, every contradiction in Preston's testimony, every lie he had told. She reminded them of Officer Santos's injuries, of the families whose cars had been forced off the road, of the reckless disregard for human life that Preston had displayed at every turn. This case is not about a mistake, Park concluded. This is about a young man who has been taught his entire life that his family name makes him special, makes him exempt from the rules the rest of us have to follow. This is about what happens when privilege meets accountability. The defendant didn't just break the law, he assaulted the very person whose job is to enforce that law, and he did it while laughing, while mocking her, while assuring her that his father would make all of this disappear. Well, ladies and gentlemen, some things cannot be made to disappear. Justice is one of them. After closings, Judge Monroe announced he would deliver his verdict the following morning. The courtroom emptied slowly, people talking in hushed voices about the testimony they had witnessed. That night, Officer Maria Santos sat in her small apartment, staring at the bruises that had faded from purple to yellow-green, the physical evidence of that night finally disappearing, even as the memories remained sharp and clear. She had joined the force because she believed in service, in protecting people, in upholding the law impartially. And tonight, she would learn whether the system she had devoted her life to would stand behind those principles, or whether Preston Ashford was right, whether his father really did own people like her. The next morning, Courtroom 7B was even more packed than before. News of the trial had spread, and the gallery included not just curious spectators, but police officers in uniform, sitting in solidarity with their sister in blue. The message was clear. This case mattered beyond just one incident. This was about whether the law meant anything at all. Judge Elias Monroe entered at precisely 9 o'clock. Everyone rose. The bailiff called the court to order. Monroe took his seat, arranged the papers before him with methodical care, and then looked out at the assembled crowd. His gaze swept across the courtroom, past the prosecutors and defense attorneys, past Preston Ashford, who sat with his father's hand on his shoulder, past the gallery filled with police officers and citizens, and finally settled on Officer Santos. Then he began to speak. In 37 years on the bench, I have presided over thousands of cases. I have seen humanity in all its complexity, people at their best and their worst, people driven by love and by hate, by desperation and by greed. I have learned that the law, at its heart, is not just a set of rules. It is a compact we make with one another, a promise that we will be governed by principles larger than our individual desires or advantages. Monroe's voice filled the courtroom, not loud but absolute, commanding attention through sheer moral force. The law works only when everyone, regardless of their station, their wealth, their connections, understands that it applies equally. The moment we create exceptions, the moment we suggest that certain people are too important or too privileged to be bound by the same rules as everyone else, we undermine the entire foundation of justice. Preston shifted uncomfortably. His father's expression had hardened. Monroe continued, his gaze now fixed on Preston. "Mr. Ashford, you are 17 years old. You come from a wealthy family. You attend an elite school. You have been accepted to an Ivy League university. By any conventional measure, you've been given every advantage that money and privilege can buy. And yet, when you stood in this courtroom under oath, you demonstrated that despite all those advantages, you have learned nothing about responsibility, nothing about accountability, nothing about the basic respect we owe to one another as human beings." The courtroom was silent. Not a single person moved. On the night of April 14th, you made a choice to drive at nearly double the speed limit. When confronted with the consequences of that choice, you made another choice to flee from law enforcement, leading Officer Santos on a dangerous pursuit that put innocent lives at risk. When your flight ended in a crash that destroyed public property and disrupted an entire neighborhood, you made yet another choice. Not to submit to lawful arrest, not to take responsibility for your actions, but to assault the officer attempting to arrest you. Monroe leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on an edge that cut through the room like winter wind. "But perhaps most revealing of all, Mr. Ashford, is what you said to Officer Santos as she lay on the ground, injured by your actions. You told her that your father owns people like her. You told her she was finished. In that moment, you revealed exactly what you believe about the world and your place in it. You believe that your family name grants you immunity. You believe that wealth and connections place you above the law. You believe that a police officer who attempts to hold you accountable can simply be bought off or destroyed." Preston had gone completely pale. Several officers in the gallery nodded grimly. Monroe's voice rose slightly, carrying more force. "Let me be absolutely clear about something, Mr. Ashford. Your father does not own Officer Santos. Your father does not own this courtroom. Your father's money, no matter how abundant, does not purchase exemption from the law. You assaulted a police officer. You endangered lives. You destroyed property. And then you compounded these crimes by lying under oath in an attempt to evade responsibility." The judge paused, letting his words settle like stones dropping into still water. "The defense would have this court believe that you were simply a frightened teenager who made a mistake. But your actions that night and your testimony in this courtroom reveal something far more troubling. They reveal a young man who has been so insulated from consequences, so assured of his own privilege, that he genuinely cannot comprehend why he should be held accountable for his actions." Monroe looked toward Officer Santos. "Officer Santos has served this community with distinction for 12 years. She responded to your criminal behavior with professionalism and restraint. She followed protocol precisely. And for doing her job, for attempting to arrest a fleeing felon, she was assaulted, injured, and then threatened with professional destruction. She has sat in this courtroom and relived that trauma because she believes in the system. She believes that justice matters." The judge's eyes returned to Preston, and there was something absolutely implacable in that gaze. "This court finds you guilty on all counts. Guilty of assault on a police officer, guilty of felony evasion, guilty of reckless endangerment, guilty of destruction of public property. These are not mistakes, Mr. Ashford. These are choices, choices that have consequences." Preston's attorney placed a hand on his client's shoulder, but Preston seemed beyond comforting, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Monroe continued, his voice steady and inexorable. "You have shown no genuine remorse. Your testimony demonstrated no real understanding of the harm you caused. Your entire defense was predicated on the idea that your privilege should shield you from accountability. It will not. Not in this courtroom. Not under this law. The judge opened a folder before him, consulted it briefly, then looked up. The court hereby sentences you as follows. For assault on a police officer, you will serve 2 years in juvenile detention with the possibility of transfer to adult incarceration if you are not released before your 18th birthday. For felony evasion, an additional 1 year concurrent. For reckless endangerment and destruction of public property, 6 months concurrent. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Preston's face had gone from pale to grey. His father started to rise, but Monroe's voice stopped him with a single word. Sit. Preston Ashford Jr. sat. Furthermore, Monroe continued, you will be placed on probation for 5 years following your release. During this probation, you will complete 2,000 hours of community service, specifically with organizations that serve victims of violent crime. You will also be required to make restitution for all property damage, medical expenses, and lost wages resulting from your actions, including the $60,000 in damage to public utilities and Officer Santos's medical bills and lost income. Monroe paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of final judgment. Additionally, I'm ordering that a copy of this verdict, along with a full transcript of these proceedings, be sent to Yale University's admissions office. Your acceptance was contingent on maintaining good conduct and disclosing all legal issues. You failed to do either. Whether Yale chooses to withdraw their acceptance is their decision, but they will make that decision with full knowledge of your actions and your character. Preston's composure finally shattered completely. Tears streamed down his face as the full weight of consequences, real, inescapable consequences, crashed down on him like a wave. Your Honor! Richard Claiborne started to object, but Monroe cut him off with a look. Mr. Claiborne, your client had every opportunity to demonstrate responsibility, remorse, or basic human decency. He chose instead to lie, to mock, and to rely on his family name as if it were a shield against justice. It is not. It never was. It never will be. Monroe's gaze swept the courtroom one final time. Let this case serve as a reminder to everyone present. The law is not a suggestion for the poor and a technicality for the rich. Justice is not something that can be purchased or negotiated away. When you assault a police officer, when you endanger innocent lives, when you destroy property and flee from accountability, there are consequences. There must be consequences. Because without consequences, we do not have a legal system. We have only the law of the jungle, where might makes right and money makes immunity. The judge's voice dropped lower, but lost none of its intensity. Officer Santos believed in the system enough to risk her safety every day serving this community. She believed in it enough to pursue a fleeing felon despite the danger. She believed in it enough to come to this courtroom and testify about the worst night of her career. This court will not betray that faith. This court will not send the message that her attacker can buy his way out of punishment. This court will not tell every officer in this city that their safety, their dignity, and their service matter less than a defendant's bank account. Monroe brought his gavel down with a crack that seemed to echo through the very walls. Mr. Ashford, you told Officer Santos that your father owns people like her. You were wrong. The only thing your father's money has purchased today is a front-row seat to watch his son face the consequences of believing that lie. You are not above the law. You never were. And 2 years in juvenile detention will give you ample time to reflect on that reality. Another strike of the gavel. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Police officers stood and applauded. Spectators talked over one another in excited voices. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. Preston collapsed forward onto the defense table, his shoulders shaking with sobs, while his father sat frozen, apparently unable to comprehend that for once in his life, his money and power had failed to produce the desired result. Officer Maria Santos sat very still, tears streaming down her face as several of her fellow officers surrounded her with embraces and words of support. She had believed in the system, and today, finally, the system had believed in her back. Preston was led away by bailiffs, his expensive suit and perfect hair now seeming like costume jewelry on someone who had just discovered that facade and substance are very different things. His father followed, already on his phone, probably calling attorneys to discuss appeals, still unable to accept that some things cannot be fixed with money and connections. Judge Elias Monroe gathered his papers with the same methodical care he always showed, stood and exited the courtroom through his private chambers. He had presided over another case, delivered another verdict, upheld another principle. Tomorrow, there would be another case, another opportunity to demonstrate that the law means what it says. But today, in Courtroom 7B, justice had been served. The story of Preston Ashford III became something of a legend in legal circles, shared among prosecutors and police officers as proof that the system could still work when people with integrity refused to allow wealth and privilege to corrupt it. Officer Santos returned to duty and continued her career, eventually receiving a commendation for her professionalism under extremely difficult circumstances. Preston served his full 2 years, was released on his 19th birthday, and began his community service, a young man finally beginning to understand that the world he had imagined, where his name granted immunity, had never actually existed outside his own entitled mind. And Judge Elias Monroe continued to sit on the bench, a reminder that some people cannot be bought, some principles cannot be negotiated, and some courtrooms still belong to justice rather than power. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about affirming that we all live under the same law, that no family name grants immunity, and that accountability matters. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in equal justice under law, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below saying "Justice for all," or let us know where you're watching from. These stories matter because they remind us what's possible when people refuse to let privilege override principle.